I've received some feedback on this work so far from Professor van der Linden and also Professor Stilwell, but this is fresh analysis, so there may well be errors, all of which are, of course, mine. And I'm going to start by talking to you about why it's important to think about the impact of negative news, or why it might be an important thing to look at. So there can be some implications from exposure to negative news, including it leading to a host of emotions and emotional responses, from sadness to anger and anxiety. It could be used to manipulate our political opinions, alter our behaviour, and it might even affect what we dream about. So, despite these adverse effects, why is it that humans are drawn to negative content? This is due to the concept of negativity bias. That is an innate tendency amongst humans to gravitate towards negative information over positive. There's a potential evolutionary basis for this bias. That is, early humans might have prioritized negative material as a way of promoting threat detection. There is some variability in individuals' levels of negativity bias. It could be the case, for example, that those on the right-hand side of the political spectrum pay more attention to negative content than those on the left. And it's also true that in some circumstances, negativity bias might play a secondary role. It might play a supporting role behind other things that determine our level of attention. We might, as has been mentioned already today, place a greater weight on attention that aligns with our attitudes or our beliefs. However, despite these variations and the fact that negativity bias might not always be the most important thing, the evidence on the concept is clear and present in a wide variety of settings, including amongst people from young children to adults. And one of these settings is conventional news media, or the traditional news. Big traditional news sites, some of which I'm going to cover in a moment. So in traditional news media, negative content is considered to be more eye-catching, more dramatic. People who read news might prefer negative content, and this is shown in lab-based studies, even when they report beforehand that they themselves would desire for the news to become more positive. When they then think they aren't being studied, they will still have an inclination towards reading the more negative material. Journalists might adapt what they do to give more attention to negative topics or events. So they might place disproportionate emphasis upon it in response to readers' preferences, and indeed such a strategy is likely to be fruitful. There's recent research by Robertson and colleagues which shows that the number of, as the number of negative words in a headline increases, you increase the chance of someone clicking through to the full article in online news settings. And one other place in which there's good evidence for negativity bias that's also relevant to this work is when looking at news-focused tweets or Facebook posts or other social media posts. So tweets concerning political events will spread further when negative. This was identified for a whole host of political events and was present amongst the tweets of people on either side of the political spectrum. And negative phrasing of tweets can also lead to a greater retweeting and engagement of those tweets produced by the official accounts of news organisations. Yes, there's some variability in these findings, and these include one study that suggested that in fact negativity can, in some circumstances, when looking at tweets concerning the elections in Kosovo and Albania, might actually lead to reduced engagement, but as a whole, there's a robust evidence base here. What I argue is that there's less comprehensive evidence on something a bit similar that brings the two together. So we have robust evidence on negativity bias within traditional news settings and also when looking at news-focused social media posts. However, what we're less certain of is bias exhibited by people on social media towards negative news content published on traditional platforms. And we can get at that by looking at the shares of posts or articles. We can get at that looking at the number of tweets or number of Facebook posts about news articles published in online settings. So there's been some information on this so far. However, while valuable, this remains somewhat limited. It might focus on a particular country or topic, like Mexican papers specifically, or a topic such as the example there, which focuses just on news content related to the Black Lives Matter movement. And that leads us to the research question, which is, do online news articles that are negative elicit more social media shares? And I'm hoping to address this question, not focusing just on a specific news topic or a specific country, or even a specific social media site, but using somewhat more comprehensive information. And so the scope of this study is looking at, first, news articles, and I'm looking at articles published between 2019 and 2021 on 4 different news sites from both the US and UK, specifically the Daily Mail, Guardian, New York Post, and New York Times. And the scope of this study also includes social media activities, all identified social media posts on Facebook and Twitter that were identified to concern or reference one of the news articles in my scope. And here's some of the data that I'm working with. Now, the news articles were gathered from a paid for, but publicly available, paid for data set called the News on the Web corpus. And within my years of interest, there were many tens of thousands of news articles. The largest sample that I had for an individual paper was just under 34,000 for the New York Times. The News on the Web corpus has some quirks in its format, but a lot of benefits. So unlike other options that I was able to find, this does give you almost the full text of the news article, which allows you to get a really good handle on negativity and also look at other concepts, some of which I'm not covering today, but there's good level of detail in the text data. There are some quirks, of course. Here we have some @ symbols, which are inserted randomly every 200 words to prevent copyright concerns. Also, in addition to that information from the news sites, I have social media data. And the first bit of social media data I'm going to talk about is from Twitter, now called X, but this still refers to it as Twitter. Any tweets that identify or were deemed to concern a article within my sample were scraped from Twitter, and this was done using the Selenium package, and I did so by exploiting a feature that used to be available even without logging in, which was the advanced search functionality, through which you can search for specific strings in the tweets, and these strings that I've highlighted here allow me to relate back to the URLs of the articles in my in the News on the Web corpus. And I also have data from Facebook. So in a similar way to the tweets, this is any Facebook post that's identified to share a key part of the URL of a news article in my sample. These were gathered effectively from the Facebook Graph API, but they were done through an intermediary, Shareaholic, which was a method used in other previous research. The data has a relatively normal distribution once log transformed, and there were a large number of shares on average per article, particularly when looking at the number of Facebook shares. Sometimes the maximum was very large, with one particularly viral article being shared over 7.5 million times. Perhaps fortunately, there was a strong correlation between the number of tweets and the number of Facebook posts that an article would receive. And using this data, I carried out some analysis. To do this, I transformed the outcome variable, I log transformed it, as has been done in previous research, and I created a treatment variable which was a binary negativity measure that I constructed using the text of the article. I controlled for numerous covariates, such as the day of the week that the article was published on, the month, the year, as well as core article characteristics, such as the mean length of a word, the mean length of a sentence, or how many words in total it had. And I used different modelling approaches. The core models that I'm going to be showing here are based on, well, all these are based on linear regression techniques, and the core ones are done using multiple regression, but I've also got a host of different robustness checks which used other approaches. So the findings from my analysis of these tens of thousands of news articles that have been shared on different social media platforms, sometimes millions of times, was that a negative article relative to a positive one received an increased number of social shares. And we found these findings to be robust, even when using an alternate definition of the treatment variable, and when using different methods of modelling, and even when controlling for the topic of the news article, with topic being established through a topic modelling approach. The topic modelling approach or the application of a topic modelling approach also allowed for us to divide our data set to look specifically at levels of negativity bias across different topics. And doing so showed some level of stability across these different topics. The one key exception here being sport, where we do have some occasions where in certain samples we identify that the number of shares on social media platforms can fall when the article is deemed negative. So the implications of this finding that social media shares are increased when the article they concern is negative. This means that those accessing the news on social media are more likely to be exposed to negative content. Journalists may, in turn, amplify the level of negativity that they employ in their work in response to this greater engagement among social media users. It's therefore not beyond the realms of possibility that the impact of this finding could even extend beyond just those who access their news on social media, but even to those who access their news just on traditional news sites. And lastly, how does this tie into misinformation? Well, first, I should note that there is some overlap between these two topics. There's been good research on the level of negativity amongst tweets sharing false news articles, with those found to be higher in those cases. But secondly, and I think perhaps most crucially, efforts to stop misinformation and identify its spread across social media platforms, for example, must be informed by a knowledge of all the drivers of spread. And I hope that this study will, and this talk has gone a small way towards advancing that understanding. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joe. Any questions? One straight away.
I may have missed it, but did you actually define negativity and even positivity?
I did give very little information on that. So the manner in which I defined negativity for this was using the text of the article. I created using a dictionary-based approach, I created a binary negativity variable. Essentially, this was a sum of the valence of all the different words that fall within an established positive negativity dictionary, the Veda dictionary specifically.
Tried to define positivity and looked at that?
So in this instance, I am just treating a positive article as one that is not negative, and in fact, the manner in which I'm calculating something, that I'm deeming something to be positive means that to be negative means that an article is positive if it's not negative. So the results are just the inverse.
I guess I'm going to jump on, because you could have articles which are neutral, and I can imagine they'd be quite boring, so might not be shared as much. But you could imagine because negativity is essentially just a strong emotion.
Mhm.
You could also have something which is a very positive emotion, which is also as strong. For
Yep.
example, sharing pictures of cats
Yep.
or something like that, which is definitely quite viral
Yep.
and not very negative.
Yep.
So yeah, that could be an interesting. But anyway, so I'm not going to steal.
Yeah,
the time.
so
I
like
don't know if you've
just to
got a
clarify very slightly, so the method that I use to classify an article as negative, this was purely binary. So if something was not negative, it was positive. There was
Right,
nothing
okay.
that was deemed neutral, although it's certainly possible to use a different measure of negativity that also allows for some neutral articles, and that could well be a good robustness check, for example.
Okay, let's do 2 more questions. So I see Chris at the front, and I'll go towards the back.
So based on your classification metrics for negativity and positivity, wouldn't that fall into the existing problems of using, for example, bag of words sentiment analysis? So the idea that, we just take all these words and we measure them one by one and we give them a yes or a no, right? So in this case, serial killer on the loose for 17 years finally apprehended probably is quite a negative. A negative balance, if you will. And given that it's a binary, it's mostly in the negative. Although most people I'd ask would say that's strongly positive news, for example. Or if the Daily Mail publishes a story about like Princess Meghan or whatever, that actually uses a lot of words that people would associate with positive, but because of the context may be interpreted as negative. Wouldn't that mean that like a lot of these so strongly negative stories that are shared just concern things that people would find dramatic, just sort of irrelevant, regardless of whether the story itself is positive or not, right?
Mm-hmm.
A hurricane is probably negative, but a story about rescue efforts in hurricanes,
Mm-hmm.
while containing many of the same words,
Mm-hmm.
would be classified as a feel-good story by a lot of people, or a human interest story.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I completely agree with the limitations of using a dictionary-based approach to measure negativity or a host of different things. Second, one slight response is that we do include models that control for topic. So some of the problems you mentioned may not be quite so pronounced. It's possible that articles discussing hurricanes, if divided into positive and negative, might give you some information of use there. But also we are using established measures of identifying an article to be positive or negative here. And I think as soon as you move on to perhaps something more subjective, you mentioned an individual's response to an article about Meghan that was phrased positively, but because of their feelings might be deemed negative by them, then you no longer have such good grounds for such a good basis for the analysis.
Thank you.
Let's do one quick one. So put your hand down if it's a long one. It's fine. I mean, there's no... right over there.
I just wonder if we can read the readers as having the same impression. For example, in sports, so if you have a headline like "Soccer Team A defeats Soccer Team B's with 7 goals to 0."
Yeah.
Of course, it depends on whether you like Team A or Team B to interpret if it's makes you feel happy or sad. So,
I think that is a very good point, and there's a little bit of research that I didn't include in this relatively short talk, which does account for something similar to what you mentioned. So specifically, I also included some work here to identify, first of all, articles that were talking about members of an outgroup or a political outgroup relative to the political leaning of the article, and then looked at levels of negativity bias in these different articles. So that's something that accounts to some extent about the differing opinions of people, at least the differing opinions of, or the differing levels of negativity bias amongst people who read different kinds of papers. So yes, there is variation. I go a small way towards identifying that in the work